Hey everyone, my name is Ben Chaish. The Leica M11 came out today. I got to check it out and I have some thoughts. Now, while I was not one of the lucky ones to be on the kind of like pre-release embargo crowd, I do have a local Leica store, which is pretty fantastic to have that. So thank you to the good people at Leica Store Bellevue for letting me come in and nerd out with you guys for a while and check out the new M11. And honestly, for someone like me who is really into Leica cameras and uses them as my primary tool for my own professional work, these M10s came out in 2017, almost 5 years to the date that this new M11 came out. So if you're watching this and like, why is this guy so into this camera? Why is it such a big deal? These cameras have very, very long cycles. So the fact that it takes, 5 years or so for a new full M10 to M11 to come out, the day it comes out, that's like the Apple event times 10 for me. Now there's obviously a lot of amazing features in the new Leica M11, and we'll definitely get into those, but I guess I want to start with the things that I didn't exactly know from just reading a spec sheet and got to kind of see once I held the camera in my hand and checked it out for myself. So I think one of the most polarizing things about the new M11 is just the fact that the black version is made of aluminum on the top plate and the silver version is made of brass, which means the black version is significantly lighter and using a material that they've used in an M camera before, but the traditional Leica M rangefinder camera is made of brass. And so a lot of people are sort of up in arms about just A, the material choice, but then B, the idea that the two cameras are now different. And you don't necessarily get to choose based solely off the material you want, but you also are stuck with whatever color option that material comes in. But here are kind of my thoughts in comparing the black M11 to my, silver Leica M10. The black M11 is significantly lighter. It definitely feels, once you hold like an M10 and an M11 in your hand, you can instantly feel the difference. And if anybody has held maybe like a Q2, you can see that feeling where you're like, okay, this doesn't feel cheap, but it also doesn't feel like as substantial maybe as an M. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. And one of the things that I was kind of thinking of as I was using that is, oh man, I'm gonna be so frustrated. I usually try, if I can, to get a black version and a silver version. I like to have both and just know which camera is which and what lenses I feel more comfortable using on which body, all that kind of stuff. And so I was worried that the weight difference between the two bodies and then adding that to the weight difference of the lens would kind of screw things up for me. But also as I thought about it, I was realizing that like the lenses and stuff are already different. So if you're kind of changing between the two, didn't really feel like that much of a difference. And honestly, I probably preferred the lighter version just because, you feel it and it just feels like it would just be easier to carry, especially lighter weight lenses like this 28 Summicron around. So, if you're going to use it for just, throwing it on a camera strap and walking around town, let's say you're using it for street photography or just using it for more than a smaller amount of time, I think that honestly, the weight savings would be a plus and not necessarily a detriment, as a lot of people are kind of trying to put out there. And then the other thing that I was worried about with that was just going to be the overall look and feel of the black aluminum body versus the, silver brass body compared to, this generation of Leica M10 black bodies. And as you can see in these clips, they're very indistinguishable. You stick these two cameras next to each other and you are not going to really see the difference. I think the only difference I honestly really noticed is that my camera was used a lot more than these brand new M11s. And the M11 had like a bit of a texture to it on the top, which maybe this camera had at one point, but it's been very well used. And so if no one told you they were different, you probably wouldn't notice. And then one of the other things that was most interesting about the M11 was the back screen and the whole menu system. I already really like the simplicity of the M10's menu, and especially checking out other camera brands recently, the simplicity is already fantastic. But the M11 kind of picks up from that Q2, SL2, SL2S menu system that has like a really, really good quick menu and then it has another very simplistic regular menu. On the M10, you get a favorites menu, which is great, but it's just not laid out in such a nice way like the M11 is. And so just being able to see all those things in a more visual standpoint, I felt like it was really helpful, and I feel like I really appreciated that improvement to the menus. And then on that as well, the M11 has the small little custom function kind of button on the top here, which a lot of people were worried was going to be a video button like it was on the M240. But what they've done is they've made that just a custom function button. So you can use it in whatever way you want. And the brilliant thing about the Q2 and the SL2 and the SL2S is they're not marked. So you just have like a function button and whatever button you want. How you assign those buttons, you don't have to go into a menu system. You don't have to do anything. You click the button and hold it down, and then all of the options for what that button can then do for you in a custom function come up. You don't have to go into the menu. It just gives you the options right off the bat, and you can change those custom functions just on the fly. Let's say you're photographing something and then you realize you didn't like how that setup was, or you move to a new lighting situation. You actually want to control something else on your camera. Is very, very simple to change those custom function buttons. And you have one on the top. This back little dial here is now also a button, so you can push that button in and do things with it. And then they've replaced the live view button with a function button on the back here on these three little buttons on the back of the M10. Now on the M11, the live view button is replaced with the function button, so you can just use it as a live view button, or you can use it for something else if that's not your style of shooting, which is something I definitely appreciate. One of the other things that was really obvious was just how bright and contrasty the new LCD on the back was. Not that I've ever felt like my M10 was necessarily lacking, but you put them next to each other and you're like, okay, this is a newer camera, absolutely, by looking at them. Another thing that I was most intrigued by is Leica, and a lot of people are talking about, oh my gosh, this thing has electronic shutter, all this stuff, which is great. Like, I love that it has that. But the problem is the sensor readout, I'm assuming because it is a 60 megapixel sensor, has that same issue that I've run into when, adapting lenses onto like a Hasselblad camera. If you don't have an actual shutter to like stop the light from coming in, the sensor reads out not at the exact same kind of like global shutter time, which means with any kind of movement, you're going to get that like weird wobbly effect. But unfortunately, having it kick into electronic shutter over 1/4000th of a second, I would not trust that sensor and that electronic shutter to make very natural looking images. So unfortunately, that is definitely something that plagues the camera. But that being said, the base ISO on the M10 is 200. It has a 100 mode, but that's like a pull mode. And it really kind of annoys me that it has that option on here because it makes you seem like you should use it. But on the M11, one of the native ISO modes is 64, which means then in those really, really bright environments, I can still use my lenses at 1.4 if I need to, and I can just dump that ISO down to 64. Apparently, from all the things I've heard, you're not losing dynamic range. It's actually a base ISO, so you're getting a lot more dynamic range technically and better image performance there. So that's actually a really, really helpful thing. And it offsets the fact that for me at least, and the way that I go about photographing things, that electronic shutter does not seem like it's going to be a useful thing for me. But having a much lower base ISO of 64 is going to compensate and totally make up for the fact that I won't be using that electronic shutter for those times. And then while I am not a visiflex user, I've never actually used it on the M10s, but I did use the Olympus version on the M240, which is basically the exact same one that Leica used. And while that display is beautiful, and for maybe portraits, things that don't, again, have a lot of movement, it would be fantastic. But for me as a wedding photographer with movement and things like that, there is a significant amount of blackout still when using the visiflex, because obviously you have to have the sensor exposed and then the shutter has to happen, and that blackout time before it kind of like resets and reloads was just way too slow for the way that I go about photographing things. Unfortunately, I don't really see myself picking one of those up, but depending on your use case, if you do, again, like landscapes or products or commercial work or things where you can deal with a little bit of blackout after you take a photo in your viewfinder. It was great and it looked fantastic, but I think for me, the speed just wasn't up to par. And for $740, probably I'm not going to go for it, unfortunately, because again, it looks really, really good. And then one of the things that I was really excited about and then also concerned about was that USB-C port on the bottom. I was shocked that there was no cover for it or anything like that. But when I talked to the Leica experts and got kind of the specs on the whole thing, it's basically the same concept as how my iPhone just has that port exposed at all times and is weather sealed enough that, you know, I've never worried about my iPhone getting wet in that port. Obviously, a USB-C port is a little bit larger than a Lightning port, but they seem pretty darn confident that that thing in particular will definitely be not a point of failure. If anything, it's just going to be the fact that none of these lenses are weather sealed. There's no gaskets on here. So I would assume the point of failure is much more likely to be something like that than that port on the bottom, which is pretty great because that port can both offload images and have power delivery. So with a company that's charging $200 for batteries, maybe not having to have 5 batteries could be a really helpful thing. On that same note, they updated the battery. So while I'm a little bit bummed that I won't be able to use the 5 batteries that I spent so much money on in this system if I upgrade, the new batteries are a much higher capacity, and the stats that they're giving using just the rangefinder, they're saying that you can get 1,700 photos on one battery. And oftentimes I find those numbers actually be kind of conservative for the way that I photograph. And so that is actually kind of a lot. And while I would still have backup batteries and I would still buy a set, I'm pretty confident that those batteries would probably last me through an entire wedding day, which is very, very useful because there's nothing worse than having a speech or something going on and then you realize you have to change batteries because, you know, you're low on battery. And then one of the big kickers, which is fantastic, and it's one of the biggest, honestly, one of the biggest deals to me as a wedding photographer, is that 64 gigabytes of internal memory. Now, if you look at these cameras, there's just not going to be enough room in here to do dual memory card slots, especially with all of the both electronics and the manual stuff in here. It's just not going to work. Like, I can't imagine a way that that would work. And so them building in 64 gigabytes, I would have definitely loved 256 or even 128, especially at a $9,000 price point. But 64 gigs, if I'm using the lower resolution, would probably be helpful. And I guess that's another point in all this. The ability to have 60 megapixels, 36 megapixels, and 18 megapixels is actually pretty useful for someone like me. There's definitely times at a wedding, like during some of the portraits or during some of the ceremony stuff, or kind of like those key moments. That's when I use the GFX or something that has a higher megapixel count because it's fun to be able to have those extra pixels to use and blow up and all that kind of stuff if we need to. But there's a lot of other times, like all of the party dancing or some of the getting ready stuff and all those little in-between moments that like 18 megapixels would be totally fine for. And then the majority of the day, I feel like I would just use the 36 megapixel setting. And the fact that there's enough custom buttons to be able to change those back and forth very easily, I think is going to be great. But from a hypothetical standpoint, it seems like something that for my particular use case would be really, really helpful. And then one of the things that I was kind of talking to multiple different Leica people about throughout the day is how the SD card and the internal memory will kind of interact with each other. So one of the things you can do is use maybe the DNGs at 60 megapixels and the JPEGs at a lower resolution like 18. But one of the things that the camera can't do, to my knowledge, and I think it makes sense because you have to do a lot of pixel binning, is it can't, let's say, photograph 60 megapixels to an SD card and then 36 to the internal. I understand why that can't happen because I think it would just be a massive processor thing. You'd probably have to have 2 processors in there to do it. I like how it currently works with being able to either kind of like write in overflow or be able to back up back and forth. So for my use case, it should work pretty well. Overall, I'm just really excited that I have the ability to have some sort of redundancy because while these haven't failed on me yet, it still is one of those things that in the back of my mind, I'm still worried about, even though I've taken hundreds of thousands of photos with these. And speaking of my use case, I know a lot of people are already complaining about the fact that the M11 does not have a bottom plate like, every other M camera up until now. But for me, the way I photograph things, I use those hold fast moneymaker straps, and then I have to attach them right here, meaning anytime I need to change memory cards or batteries, I have to unscrew the thing from here, pop this off, then switch cards, switch batteries, whatever. And the ability to work in a faster way by ditching a plate, for me, is completely worthwhile. And from any other view other than below, you're not going to see the difference. And so from a styling aspect, it still looks like a totally normal camera in terms of an M, but I feel like it is a functionality thing, which for me is really, really helpful and beneficial. I know a lot of other people aren't going to think that way, but me as a more fast-paced working professional, fantastic, very excited about that. Another thing that people were kind of bummed about and still are bummed about, it was polarizing. I've come to really love it, is the ISO dial here. One of the things you can just do though, if you don't like it on the new M11, you have those custom function buttons. So just make one of those ISO and you're good to go. But for me, I like the very intentional way of changing my ISO, and I don't need to ever really change it at a super fast time. So pull up, move over, push down, it's not a big deal for me. And since everything else on the camera is very dial clicky oriented, I love that part of the experience of the camera is also in that same way. So I like that they kept with it, but for those who don't like it, I like that you have the ability to use another button for it. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any more questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'm definitely trying every avenue that I have to get a test unit in for a deeper review. I have some sweet gigs coming up pretty soon that I think would be really, really helpful to have these in on. So once one of my contacts somewhere is able to get me one for a more extended period of time, I'm obviously going to do a review on one as well as a direct comparison to the M10, especially looking at images and dynamic range and high ISO performance, because I think that those are some of the most important things to me that are still kind of unanswered in a comparison setting. And if you want more content about Leica cameras, which I'm assuming you probably do because you've made it this far, you can subscribe to the channel right here, and then you can check out one of these videos and one of these playlists to learn more about my thoughts about Leica cameras and the review on the M10.